Hello, everybody. Welcome. We will begin in just 1 minute while everybody gets settled in. Well, hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Melissa Asu. I am the Senior Manager for the Champion Society team here at the National Park Foundation. Thank you so much for joining me in this conversation today. There are so many of you tuning in from all across the country, so a really warm welcome. I just wanted to take a really quick minute to thank you for supporting national parks and all their future explorers through the National Park Foundation. Your commitment to these beautiful spaces resulted in $110 million going into parks this past year alone, and over 270,000 donors like you all made this monumental impact possible, so thank you. And now, to keep us moving to what we're all here for, it is my pleasure to introduce Will Shafroth, President and CEO of the National Park Foundation. Since 2015, Will has steered the foundation to its current success, raising more than $1 billion for national parks across the country, all of which would not be possible without you, our incredible supporters. So welcome, Will.
Thank you, Melissa, and thanks everybody for joining us today. This is possibly the largest group we've ever had on a webinar, and I like to give my full credit to my friend Ed O'Keefe for making that happen in this great book about the women in Theodore Roosevelt lives and his life, and you know, just giving a different dimension to the story of Teddy Roosevelt, who is an iconic figure in our country's history. Why don't I just acknowledge that, you know, initially 1,700 of you have signed up for this thing. So we're really hoping that when we hear about the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt, the women who created a president, we guys can spread the word about this great book. Among those on the call are some of the foundation's most generous donors. Thank you to the Champion Society members and to everyone who contributes so generously to our parks. As we talk about the legacy of President Roosevelt today, it's only appropriate that I extend a special welcome to members of the Teddy Roosevelt Society at the National Park Foundation. Members of the Teddy Roosevelt Society have made a lifetime commitment of $1 million or more to the National Park Foundation. Thank you all. Thank you to all of you for sharing President Roosevelt's vision for national parks. I'm now happy to welcome my friend Ed O'Keefe, who I've known for about 6 years. We've been in the trenches together on some things, and Ed is a great champion for our national parks. He's done incredible work in the media, and he now spearheads the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library Foundation, with whom the National Park Foundation works in Western North Dakota. We'll talk more about the Library Foundation later in the conversation. My pleasure to welcome Ed to this discussion about Teddy Roosevelt, who's often called the conservation president. Welcome, Ed.
Well, thank you, Will. It's a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for your leadership of the National Park Foundation.
That's great. Well, thank you. Let's just start at the beginning, Ed. Teddy Roosevelt is certainly one of those mythic American figures in the history of this country who fascinates everybody. And while there have been many books written about this man, no one has looked at him from the point of view of the women in his life. So tell us a bit about what spurred you to take this approach, especially what was interesting about the women in his life.
Well, the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt argues that perhaps the most masculine president in the American memory was actually the product of extraordinary women. And you see them here on the screen. Theodore Roosevelt's mother, Mittie, who's in the center of the screen, his 2 sisters, Bammy and Connie, and his 2 wives, Alice and Edith. And they've always been there as a part of TR's story, but sort of hiding in the background. Nobody has put the spotlight on these extraordinary women and told their stories, brought them out into public view. You know, so much of the TR story is that self-made man. And here we have these extraordinary women who really helped create and propel TR to the political and personal success that he had.
That's great. Well, I can speak for myself. I have 2 sisters and a very strong mother and 2 very strong grandmothers, and I can tell you they definitely had an impact on me. How about you in your life, Ed? Do you have some strong women in your life too?
I am the result of the women in the arena. My mother is, you know, she took me out to Theodore Roosevelt National Park. We'd hike out there. We'd see the Medora musical. The book is dedicated to my wife, Allison. I have a daughter who's 13, so I'm very fortunate. I think that's sort of the takeaway theme of the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt. If we are fortunate in our lives, we all have mothers or brothers or sisters or family friends who pick us up and propel us when we're most down in life. And Theodore Roosevelt was no different, even though we haven't really heard that version of the story.
I would be remiss to not mention my two daughters who really run the show in our house. So that's the final thing I'll say about that. Well, let's go to Mitty in the middle here. His mom was obviously he had these sisters, and we'll hear about them too, but especially Mitty. Tell us about who she was and how she very likely profoundly affected President Roosevelt.
Mitty Roosevelt is unsung in history. She is vivacious and has this really effervescent personality. She's the diametric opposite of Theodore Roosevelt's father, who is stoic and kind of reserved and rather a disciplinarian, stern. Mitty is the source of her son's personality. She has these coy turns of phrase, and it's actually Mitty who introduces her son Teddy to the phrases like the African proverb, speak softly and carry a big stick. They're all in these McGuffey readers that she reads to the children at night. She's a Southerner. She is living in Georgia for most of her life. She transplants to New York shortly before the Civil War. So she's also, showing her son and her family how to live in a house divided, in a nation divided. She's a devout. Her brothers are fighting for the Confederacy, so I think there's just some fascinating kind of influences. When Theodore Roosevelt's father dies very tragically and early in his life, at age only 46, TR is 20 at the time. It's Mitty that teaches her children, we need to live for the living, not for the dead, that you would dishonor the memory of your father if you didn't live a life of purpose. And so those are two things we really identify with TR: his resilience through physical and emotional pain, the will to keep going in the light of the horrific, tragic events that will inevitably come in life, and this really infectious personality. Those were really all due to Mitty.
So great. So Alice was also obviously an important person in his life. His first wife. Tell us a bit about her.
Well, Alice is the most eligible bachelorette in all of Boston when TR meets her. And now remember, this is not the Theodore Roosevelt we all know from legend and lore. This is not the Roosevelt of Mount Rushmore. In college, TR's contemporaries, his college classmates, describe him as eccentric, half crazy, very strange and odd. He was more into taxidermy. And he was, in his wake, you could smell formaldehyde and, specimens in various stages of decay. So the idea that Teddy Roosevelt at age 20 was going to pursue the most eligible bachelorette in all of Boston was a little absurd.
Right.
2 years, tens of thousands of dollars. He finally wins her. And Alice is from this very progressive, reform-minded Brahmin family. It's really from that family and from Alice that his reform ethic is informed. He writes this extraordinary thesis in 1880 where he argues for equality for men and women. He says that women should have the right to vote 40 years before suffrage. He calls for equal pay for equal work. He says women should be doctors, lawyers, and judges. He suggests that perhaps women should not take their husband's name upon marriage. He says women should own property, another really reform-minded thought in 1880. That's all the influence of Alice and her really progressive, reform-minded family.
That's very interesting. Wow. That was a little before his time on those issues. So that's pretty amazing. Were those ideas beginning to take currency in Boston, or was that just that she was kind of ahead of her time too?
Well, the reform, I write in The Loves of Theodore Roosevelt about the origins of knickerbockers. Knickerbocker comes from an 1821 book by Washington Irving, A Satirical History of New York. And that was a name for those who came over as the new settlers of, New Amsterdam, which became New York City. So you could win your way into the Knickerbocker class, but a Brahmin is actually from that's the highest level of Hindu priest in the caste system. So there's no way into the caste system, right? So Knickerbockers and Brahmins didn't often mix, just as New Yorkers and Bostonians don't always mix today. You know, there's this great sort of the Boston toast, and this is good old Boston, the home of the bean and the cod, where the Lowells talk only to the Cabots and the Cabots talk only to God. Alice was a Cabot. I mean, her father was from that lineage. So it was a really kind of interesting boiling pot of progressive, reform-minded conversation, you know, not just in equality of women, but economics, in philanthropy. This idea of giving back was taking root in the Brahmin caste, you know, to whom much is given, much is required. Certainly Theodore Roosevelt embraced that as well. So it was really, you know, it was in the water, but it was not, you know, was not universally held. It was unusual.
Yeah, Abigail Adams was another example of that from that area and that era, a little earlier, actually. But and she obviously had a big influence on her husband John Adams. So very interesting. So the other thing I was going to ask you about about Alice, is that I read that she steered him away from science towards politics. I'd love to hear you talk about that too.
Yes, well, science and natural science was not, they were not issuing tickets in the class that Alice wrote in. You know, there were a couple of factors at work at that time, Will. You know, number one, natural science was really shifting from being in the outdoors to being in the laboratory. And TR did not want to work in a laboratory. He wanted to be out in nature. He wanted to be you know, ornithology and the natural sciences and such. So that was simultaneous, but it was really Alice who understood, along with his sisters and his mother, that Teddy needed to be out in the public. He was an you know, an extrovert, and he wanted to affect public policy and change. He actually first looked into being a lawyer, but he realized, wait a second, you know, a lawyer can just interpret the law. A politician makes the law. And he quickly changed course, and Alice was instrumental in that change.
So cool. Were there women in his life who helped deepen his love for the nature and natural history?
Well, I love this story from TR's childhood. You know, they took these grand European tours and trips, and they all write down the miles that they walked. I mean, you know, they took a European tour for nearly 1 year, stayed in 66 hotels in 8 countries.
Wow.
And on one of the days from his diary, he writes that, you know, he walked for 22 miles, Bammy walked for 18 miles, his brother walked for 12 miles, his mother walked for 9 miles, and his sister walked for 3 miles. This was a family that knew that nature was their classroom. They got outdoors together. And that was really, from a very young age, infused and in TR as the tonic, the cure for not just his asthma, but for depression in later life. You know, that he wanted to get outdoors and to really live.
It sounds like maybe they were the early precursor to the Fitbit, you know, counting your steps and really, you know, counting your walking areas, things like that. So
exactly.
Ahead of his time in a whole other way. So, you know, one of the things that you know, we're talking about his mom and his, there was an important event that happened in his life in February 14th, 1884, I think it was. Talk about that and maybe how that affected his life as well.
Well, so let's back up to February 11th. Theodore Roosevelt is a bit of a numerologist. He believes in providential signs, and he announced his public engagement to Alice on February 14th, 1880. So he naturally believed that their first daughter would be born on February 14th, 1884. So confident was he of this that he returned to Albany to finish his work in the New York State Assembly. The baby was born on February 12th, so he wasn't present, which wasn't unusual for the day. He receives a telegram telling him that the baby's been born and that Alice is only fairly well. And then he receives a second telegram, and the contents of that telegram have been lost to history, but we know TR's reaction. His face went ashen white, and he ran from the New York State Assembly to the train station in Albany. He took an excruciating 5.5-hour train ride home because of this thick, dense fog that had descended over Manhattan. I mean, so bad was the weather that the New York Times actually published a story calling it suicidal weather. You couldn't see 2 inches in front of your face. So he couldn't get a hansom cab from Grand Central Terminal. He had to walk to 6 West 57th Street, about 15 blocks, where his brother Elliot said, "There is a curse on this house. Mother is dying and Alice is dying too." TR ran up to the 3rd floor. He held Alice in his arms until 2:30 in the morning, when he was called down to the 2nd floor of the home. Mitty, who was surrounded by her family, died of typhoid fever. Then he went back up to the 3rd floor, where he caressed and held Alice for another 11 hours, refusing to let go of her until 1:30 in the afternoon, when she too died. February 14th, 1884, the date that he thought his daughter would be born, the anniversary of his engagement. He lost his mother and his wife on the same day in the same house.
Wow. So, what did he do after that? I mean, I know this answer a little bit, but I do think it's important to kind of talk about, like, this shocking, maybe the 2 most important people in his life, maybe certainly the 2 most important women in his life died, hours apart. How did he handle that?
He wrote an X in his diary and said, "The light has gone out of my life." And the light was sunshine. Alice, her nickname was Sunshine. And with the loss of her, he really truly felt his life was over. He did not stand for re-election, and he fled to the Dakota Badlands. He had invested half of his inheritance in cattle the year before, so he always intended to have a life in both the East and the West, but certainly not under these conditions. He left the child in the care of Bammy, his older sister, without which he would not have been able to go to the Badlands. And he lived there as a rancher and a cowboy for the better part of 2 years. At the Elkhorn Ranch, it's now known as the cradle of conservation.
Yeah.
It was on that trip and during that time that he really saw the degradation of species. He saw the rapid industrialization of the nation. He got to commune with nature as he did as a child, and nature again was his healer. Nature saved his life. And it was that appreciation during those 2 years. And he looked back and said, "I never would have been president without my experiences in North Dakota." I would argue, without his experiences in North Dakota, he's not the conservation president. He doesn't preserve 230 million acres of land, 150 national forests, 51 bird preserves, 18 national monuments, 5 national parks, 4 game preserves. That's an environmental record, a conservation record that has not been equaled to this day. And it really all stems from those very tragic events on February 14th, 1884, and the 2 years that he was able to live as a rancher and a cowboy in North Dakota.
It really was the foundation of our conservation movement in a lot of ways. I mean, he saw the need through the Antiquities Act and the creation of, like you said, a system of wildlife refuges, and really there were really ideas around a system of national parks and other public lands that were preserved for their own right and for the benefit of not just of humans, but for the birds and the bees and the animals.
Well, and when he did that, Will, the speaker, when Theodore Roosevelt proposed his first conservation bill, and he used that word, conservation, the Speaker of the House said, "There will not be 1 dime for scenery." There was no debate on the other side. There was no contrary position. It was, what are you talking about, right? The land is there to be built. It's there to be sold. And he had a very different perspective. There are letter after letter after letter between Theodore and his older sister, Bammy. Bammy, about conservation, Bammy was, as I say in the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt, sort of like what Robert F. Kennedy was to John F. Kennedy, this strategic advisor she understood the political chessboard much better than him. And it was Bammy, actually, and his wife, Edith, who understood he needed executive power, that TR was not one to be in a subservient position. And a lot of the work that he accomplished in conservation was, I so declare it, right? He used the
Right.
Antiquities Act in a way that it probably wasn't intended to be used, or at least in the interpretation of Congress. And he changed the understanding of conservation and the relationship with the natural world. Again, really due to that relationship with his family, his mother, Mittie, and that strategic relationship with Bammy and Edith.
And you realize, I mean, as you and I have been at, you spend some time in Western North Dakota, certain times of the year, it will affect you in your very core. It's a harsh environment for a lot of the year. Very, very cold and windy, and very, very hot and dusty, and the landscape itself is rugged, and like there's no forgiveness. I mean, it's beautiful in so many ways, but it's just a tough place. And I guess maybe what I thought, like maybe it's what he needed, after this great loss.
In the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt, I was fortunate to discover 11 new letters. Greg Wynn, the president of the TRA, miraculously opened a safe that hadn't been opened since 1954. And inside it were these newly and recently discovered letters that include some from 1885, where TR talks about the conditions of the Badlands. This letter that's on screen actually is a letter from Theodore Roosevelt's father to his son, Theodore, at 3 years old.
Wow.
And it's remarkable. It's got to be the oldest letter ever written from father to son. Thee had just come from the White House with a meeting with President Lincoln. And he says in this letter, dated December 31st, 1861, so right as the Civil War had begun, I have just come from the home of the president who governs our whole country. And outside the home, there is a statue. And on that statue, there is a phrase that I want your mother to read for you, so when I get home, you can repeat it to me. And the statue, which still stands in Lafayette Square to this day, says, our federal union, it must be preserved. So, I mean, think of that extraordinary example that TR, this is a father writing to the future president of the United States after coming from a meeting with President Lincoln and instilling this virtue of preserving the Union from the beginning. It's just the family influence on TR is really what made him so distinct and unique. And just as you said, Will, I think when you're out east, when you're at Sagamore Hill or the Boyhood Home, both national park sites, wonderful sites, you feel Theodore Roosevelt's ghost. When you're in the West, when you're in Theodore Roosevelt National Park, you feel the presence of Theodore Roosevelt's spirit. That's where he was healed. I've never gone to that park and not met someone who is going through a divorce, or their mother died, or somebody in their family is battling a serious illness. They come there and they feel the presence of nature and this overpowering 65 million years of geologic history unfolding in front of you like a textbook. Theodore Roosevelt said of the Badlands, it looks as Edgar Allan Poe would write.
Yeah.
It's a mystical, really wonderful place. A great example of a park that otherwise wouldn't exist without this conservation legacy of TR.
So great. So I'm going to come back to that part of the world in a second, but let's talk about Edith for a second, because she had a different kind of impact on our country, and as a first lady, was her own force of nature and her own power center, and she was going to change some things and how things got done. So talk a bit about that. I think it's a whole different aspect of the women's impact in his life.
Yeah, in the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt, I call Edith the first modern first lady. So she was the first lady to have a social secretary, which every single subsequent first lady has had since. She was the one who redesigned the White House to actually include a west and an east wing. It was she and Theodore that made the decision to stop calling it the Executive Mansion and start calling it the White House, a much more populist name. She planted the Colonial Garden, which became the Rose Garden. She started the First Lady's Portraits collection. She collected the china, not only of her administration, but past administrations, to establish the White House China collection. But more than these physical changes, she read 4 to 5 newspapers a day. She was the first person that Theodore talked to in the morning, the last one he talked to at night. She was universally known as a better judge of character. In fact, it was TR himself who said, "Whenever I go against Edith's judgment, I regret it." And none other than Franklin Delano Roosevelt said of his aunt, Edith, that she managed Theodore quite cleverly without his being conscious of it. No slight achievement anyone will concede. So she never wanted the spotlight. She was much more taciturn. She had a fabulously interesting relationship with Alice, the daughter, Roosevelt Longworth, which we can talk about a bit because everybody loves Alice. But she just had this influence and didn't want to be known for it. Burned a lot of the correspondence between she and her husband, specifically so history could not figure out what the degree of her. You mentioned Abigail Adams. We've got these wonderful letters that David McCullough was able to call upon between Abigail and John. Well, Edith didn't want that to be known, so she purposefully destroyed a lot of the correspondence. So we just kept thinking it was all TR all the time.
Huh.
The myth of the self-made man.
So interesting. Well, let's pivot in our let's go. Well, actually, I'm interested in the daughter for a minute because you mentioned that you piqued everybody's interest. So we got a couple more minutes here. Give us a minute or so of really interesting information about her.
Well, Alice Roosevelt Longworth is the first born in 1884 and the last to die in 1980 of all of the Roosevelt children. She knows every president from her father to Gerald Ford. In the audio book of The Loves of Theodore Roosevelt, we actually include audio recordings of each of the characters. And the one of Alice is a conversation with Richard Nixon shortly after the election, in which she's teasing the president because he's 60 years old, and he says, "Well, that's too old to be president." Like a little bit of an irony.
I know, exactly. That's a very timely comment.
It's of Alice that Theodore says, "I can either run the country or I can control Alice. I cannot possibly do both." And she gives as good as she gets. She says of her father, he wants to be the bride at every wedding, the corpse at every funeral, and the baby at every christening. So she's just this really interesting, great relationship dynamic with them. There's the psychic trauma of being abandoned essentially by her father. She has a very, prickly relationship with Edith as her stepmother. And then she has these moments of really wanting to be closer to TR. She marries the Speaker of the House, Nicholas Longworth. She's known as the second Washington Monument. She lords over Washington for almost 80 years. Has that pillow in her house that says, "If you have nothing nice to say, come and sit by me."
So great. What a good sense of humor. Well, listen, the last thing I want to cover before we open up for questions is to talk a bit about the work that we've had a chance to do together. We're the National Park Foundation obviously is committed to supporting the parks all over the country, including Theodore Roosevelt National Park in Western North Dakota. And some years ago, a group of people really came up with a really compelling idea to create a presidential library for Theodore Roosevelt, which there did not exist one, which is, compared to some of the other presidents that do have them, it seemed like it was a missed opportunity. And so instead of being kind of in a more traditional place like in New York City, decided that this library would be in Western North Dakota, adjacent to the national park, which is, as Ed just said, was really formed the man in a lot of ways that he became president and became a major conservation advocate. So it's got a really diverse partnership between the state, the Park Service, the town of Medora, the Teddy Roosevelt Presidential Library Foundation, and the National Park Foundation. And Ed's the CEO of the Library Foundation. And talk a bit about what you all are doing there and how you, with this broad partnership, hopes to make this a real destination for people around the world to learn about TR and his role in shaping the country and the world through his work in conservation.
Well, first, my thanks for your leadership, Will, and the partnership of the National Park Foundation, the National Park Service. I think it's a stellar example of the excellent work that you do at the National Park Foundation. The pillar principles of the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library are leadership, citizenship, and foremost, conservation. As you can see here in the pictures you're seeing on screen, Snohetta, the architect of the 9/11 Museum, has designed a beautiful building that almost disappears into the landscape. You've got a 360-degree view, 38 feet in the air of the majestic Badlands, perfectly framing Theodore Roosevelt National Park. I mean, we really believe that this will be the only presidential library where our objective is to not just get you in a museum, it's to get you out. It's to get you on a hike, to get you on a picnic with your family, to ride horseback, to explore the national park that is literally a stone's throw away from the library. We are under construction, and we have an anticipated opening of July 4th, 2026, which is the 250th anniversary of America.
So awesome. I'll just say that in these conversations we've had over the last 6 or 7 years, I guess it's been between the Park Service and the Foundation and the Presidential Library Foundation. It's the Presidential Library Foundation has really done an amazing job of both raising the money and creating an incredible vision for this thing. And the other byproduct of that has been to kind of push the Park Service and the National Park Foundation to lift up the visitor experience within the national park. And like many national parks around our country, this one needs more investment, frankly. And both at the Painted Canyon Visitor Center, where you first arrive, and in the town of Medora, there's the main visitor center. So this has really helped our work and the work of the national parks to realize that we're about to have this amazing library over here on the hillside, and we gotta use this as a moment to make sure that our park is as compelling as the library. And so yeah, I mean, just speak a little bit more also to the work that the governor and the town have done too. They're all part of this, and it's an unusually broad and deep partnership.
Well, we've raised over $319 million on a $450 million goal. The state of North Dakota is $50 million of that $319 million in the form of an endowment, which will perpetually support our ongoing operations. Once we open, we have over $100 million in infrastructure commitment from the state of North Dakota in the roads, in the sewers, in the water systems. And now we're involved in this very exciting conversation with Theodore Roosevelt National Park, the National Park Service, and the National Park Foundation. I mean, I hope that this becomes a prototype park of all the great work that you're doing across the park system: multimodal transportation, housing improvements, looking at how a visitor's center can really cooperate with both the state and the local entities, not just the park itself. There's so much that can be done with we get 800,000 visitors a year to Theodore Roosevelt National Park. We have an existing Medora musical and amphitheater that draws 125,000 from May through September. So there's enough of a population and interest here that we can do things that perhaps can't be done at busier parks where the impact would be too much to do. And I think that's what's so exciting about the forthcoming presidential library and the work that we're doing with NPF and the national park.
So great. Well, and I'm not sure exactly how you found enough time you're doing aside from your day job to write this book, but we thank you for doing that. And while we are waiting here for the first set of questions, just very quickly, what do you think President Roosevelt would think about this work that's happening in Western North Dakota?
Well, I mean, I think that he would want the conservation fight to go on. I mean, that he would love the work that you're doing at the National Park Foundation. He, as I said, when in his time, he was greeted not with a counter argument, but with befuddlement, that there was no counter argument to conservation in the early 1900s. Now it's a real challenge. There are a lot of hurdles and a lot of different countering objectives. And I think, America's best idea continues to be its best idea. We don't have, we don't have kings and queens in our history. We don't have some of the other cultural institutions of Europe. We have the beauty of our lands, the majesty of our rivers, the incredible mountains. And I think Theodore Roosevelt would be right there in the fight with you.
Great. Well, thank you, Ed. Melissa, you're monitoring the chat for some good questions. Can you pose a few for our guest tonight?
Yes, I hate to interrupt this really exciting conversation, but we did have quite a few burning questions come in. And I wanted to start with probably our youngest viewer, Alexander, aged 8 from Detroit, Michigan, who really wants to know what Teddy's friends called him from college throughout his life.
Ah, Alexander, that's a great question. Thank you. And I'm coming back through Detroit on the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt book tour this summer, so hope to see you. There only a very, very few people called him Teddy. He actually did not like the name. Alice, his first wife, was the one that really called him Teddy, or in the letters that I discovered for the book, Teddykins. And once she died, once she passed away, he really did not like anybody to call him Teddy. It was too painful to hear the name that his first wife had really ascribed to him. So very, very rarely did anyone call him Teddy after Alice died. He was mostly Theodore or the Colonel. After he was a colonel in the Rough Rider, he preferred to be called Colonel to even President Roosevelt.
Very good.
Another question is, where and under what circumstances did TR meet Edith? And what kind of background did she come from?
Great question. Okay, so the crazy thing about Teddy and Edith is that they knew each other from when Edith was 3 years old. So she knew him for 57 of his 60 years of life. There's this fabulous photograph of Theodore watching the funeral procession of Abraham Lincoln's catafalque in New York. And we know that it's Theodore looking out the window of his grandfather's townhome because Edith was with him. That's how long they knew each other. Everyone thought they were going to get married. They were sweethearts. When she turned 17, they celebrated her birthday together. They went picking water lilies. They went out on a boat ride in Oyster Bay. And then on August 22nd, 1878, they had a big blow-up fight. They argued and broke up. No one knows what exactly happened on August 22nd, 1878. Only Theodore and Edith know the truth. The only thing they ever said about it, Theodore wrote a letter to his sister Bammy and said, "I suppose we had and have tempers far from being the best." And Edith simply said Theodore had not been nice. That's all we know. That's why we've got to adapt the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt, so we can speculate on what happened in that room. But they broke up on August 22nd, 1878, and 2 months later, he met Alice Hathaway Lee, and it was Edith who. So yeah, they knew each other for pretty much their entire life. And when fate intervened on February 14th, 1884, it was one person that Teddy said he didn't want to see again, and that was Edith, because he knew as soon as he saw her, they'd fall back in love, and he feared he would dishonor the memory of his first wife. When they did fatefully meet back in New York, that's exactly what happened. They became secretly engaged and actually got married in London to avoid any scandal about a second marriage.
Sounds like a great show I'd want to watch. So another question that came in, how aware was Teddy Roosevelt of others who wrote about the environment and conservation, like John Muir and his predecessors?
Very, very well aware. I mean, there's the famous trip that John Muir and Roosevelt take as president to Yellowstone, a 2-week trip where he travels all the way across the country. He was very close with John Burroughs. Of course, there's the famous photograph of he and Burroughs together. He was, Gifford Pinchot in his cabinet was helping to found the U.S. Forest Service. He was not the inventor of these ideas, but he listened, right? He knew a lot of the people in the conservation movement. And Douglas Brinkley has written a wonderful book, The Wilderness Warrior, on this subject. It's a little longer than The Loves of Theodore Roosevelt, so there's a lot more information to know about TR's conservation legacy. But yes, he was contemporaries with many of these conservationists. He wrote to them, he talked to them, he listened to them, and he put their ideas into action. I mean, they had a champion in the White House who wanted to see conservation be a real issue, and made policy happen as a result.
Obviously he was surrounded by all these great, strong, influential women in his life. And somebody wanted to know, did the women in his life have any influence in including him in Mount Rushmore?
Well, that's a great question. The sculptor who did Mount Rushmore had sculpted Theodore. And there was a pretty big debate. They knew it was going to be Washington and Jefferson, and it did closely coincide with the 100th anniversary of Jefferson's death. Actually, interestingly, Theodore was beat out by Jefferson for the last spot in the National Mall. The tidal basin was open, and there was a debate about what to put there. Originally, there were designs for a monument to Theodore Roosevelt. That later shifted to Theodore Roosevelt Island, which is now a national park site, once the Jefferson Memorial was approved and built in the tidal basin. So it was really his sisters and Edith who worked with the sculptor of Mount Rushmore to suggest that he would be the logical contemporary choice. But the sculptor was inclined to favor TR anyway, because they had actually known one another. But obviously that his sisters and his wife Edith are undoubtedly responsible for putting TR in the pantheon of great presidents. They served on the board of the American Museum of Natural History and approved that becoming New York State's memorial to Theodore Roosevelt. They preserved his boyhood home, which of course now has become a national park site. They fought for what became Theodore Roosevelt National Park, was first a memorial park. All of those efforts date back to Bammy and Connie and Edith really fighting to make sure that his legacy was preserved.
How about his daughter? Did she continue to advocate for him after he died? Because they had a kind of a prickly relationship.
I mean, yes and no. She wasn't as fervent. She has this kind of whimsical kind of indifference where she kind of laughs and says Washington is a big village and I have all the information on the villagers. She thinks it's a little overdone at times, and doesn't have a great relationship with Eleanor Roosevelt, fights constantly with FDR. She's always a reliable source of a nasty quote about her cousins when the Democratic Hyde Park Roosevelts rise and Theodore's reputation is taking a bit of a hit at this time. So she doesn't really advocate for the legacy so much as just to, kind of be one of those characters in the story throughout the next few decades.
That's great. Melissa, maybe one more question.
Yes, I did want to make sure to get a question in about this fantastic library. Thank you for sharing these beautiful renderings. We cannot wait to see it when it opens. Now, Will, how has philanthropy played a role in supporting the establishment of this library?
I mean, it's Theodore Roosevelt was raised by his family who, as I mentioned before, believed to whom much is given, much is required. His father, these famous stories where his contemporaries would see him and they'd say, "How much this time, Theodore?" Right? He's the co-founder of the American Museum of Natural History. He's the founder of the first orthopedic hospital in New York. He was one of the original founders of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I think that there was this philosophy of philanthropy and giving back that was imbued in the Roosevelt family. And it's really been just heartening to see the response to the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library. I mean, I mentioned we've raised $319 million over essentially the last 4, maybe 5 years. As you said, Will, maybe I'm the only author who would write a book while building a library. I'm not quite sure how that makes sense, how we've done both at the same time. But without private investment, without private philanthropy, this project would not happen. Period. There is no government entity that would push it. There is no state that is powerful enough to do it. It's really individuals banding together. And it's not about the past. Theodore Roosevelt's legacy is well enshrined. We are not really here to tell people that story. We're here to tell them that story to inspire them for the future, to be the change they want to be in the world, to get in the arena, as TR said, and realize that individuals have the power to take collective action. and to use that life. His legacy, it's taken care of, but we want, lessons from the past to better inform us about the present and really make a better future. And so that's what philanthropy does. It has impact.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
and hats off to you and your team there and the board you've assembled and the other donors who see that, what you just described, the kind of the bigger vision here. It's not always easy to find people who would necessarily want to invest in a place, let's say in the out of the ordinary presidential library in Western North Dakota, like you said, that folds right into the landscape. You've really, you've not followed the traditional playbook at all. And I think that's to your credit. And I think the people who really understand Teddy Roosevelt and understand the landscape will applaud you. So thank you.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for your partnership, Will. And I know we're not using the R word, but thank you for your 10 years of service. I can't wait to see what you do in the next chapter. Some of TR's greatest adventures came after that big job. So we'll see what Will Shafroth's doing next.
All right.
Keep us updated. Well, thank you so much, Ed. And thank you to all of our viewers who tuned in today. We are so grateful all of you could join us. And please know that each of you is responsible for the adventures that all future explorers and outdoor enthusiasts will have in our national parks. So thank you. And Ed and Will, thank you for your work connecting so many visitors to these historical, cultural, and meaningful places. There were so many great questions that we didn't get time to address today, and we want to make sure to hear from you. So email us at events@nationalparks.org to stay connected and with any questions you have. So we hope you all continue to tune in with us. We look forward to talking with you again soon. Thank you all again for joining us and have a great evening, everybody.
Everybody.
Thank you very much. Great to be with you.